This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 520 of the Late Round Podcast, so many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I've said it time after time, but regression is everything in fantasy football. The game of football is a pretty small sample game, and crazy things can happen in those small samples. But when fantasy managers are making decisions off of the things that they see and the statistics that they analyze within these small samples, that can cause issues. Now, fantasy managers are getting a lot better, and I mean a lot better, at recognizing regression. We see that reflected in average draft position each and every year. Back in the day, a player having some insane outlier season would have almost guaranteed a high draft slot the following year. The public is sharper now, though, so that doesn't happen at the same rate. Even still, it's good to spot where regression can occur year over year because it'll give you a better grasp on both players and teams. It'll make you a better fantasy football player. And the team part is important here. I think most people look at player level regression, but they'll often ignore the team element. But everything on the projections front starts at the team level first. And there are some really easy ways to spot team level regression. I've done this episode the last couple of seasons, so some of this may sound familiar. But on a team level, what I think is easiest to look at when it comes to regression is touchdowns and play calling tendencies. On the touchdown front, you can simply look at total touchdowns scored, or you can look at pass to rush touchdown ratio. Or to put that another way, how those touchdowns are being converted. On the play calling front, I like to look at pass to rush attempt ratio. With both touchdowns and play calling, numbers will tend to regress to a mean. For example, from 2011 through 2019, so the last 9 NFL seasons where we have next season data, we've had 28 seasons where a team scored 50 or more touchdowns. Of those 28, only 3 were able to increase their touchdown total the following year, and the average decrease was 11.4 touchdowns. So just from that simple way of looking at things, you can already say to yourself, hey, if a team was really good at scoring touchdowns one season, maybe we shouldn't automatically project that team to score just as many the next season. Because chances are that team did so well because they were a little bit fortunate. Whether that was because of their schedule, their lack of injury, whatever the case, they were likely a little bit lucky. And we don't want to bank on something like that. The same thing happens with play calling too. Over the same 9-year time frame, there have been 30 teams that finish a season with more rush attempts than pass attempts. Of those 30 teams, only 3 of them actually became more run heavy the following season. You can probably tell why this would be helpful knowledge to have in your brain before your fantasy drafts. If a team did really well or was placed at the extreme in one of these categories, it can change the dynamic of the players on those teams in fantasy football. I focus on touchdowns and play calling because those 2 areas are the 2 that drive fantasy football the most. Touchdowns are the biggest scoring boost that you can get, and play calling can dictate volume, or at least how volume gets divvied up in an offense. So on today's show, I'm going to walk through some regression candidates at the team level from a play calling and a touchdown perspective. Next week, then, I'll dig into individual players. Before getting into the data, basketball fans, the NBA Conference Finals are happening right now, and FanDuel is offering a special new user bonus. Place a bet on any single team's money line, and you'll receive exclusive plus 3,000 odds for that wager. All you have to do is head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook, create an account, and take advantage of this amazing NBA playoff odds boost. Maximum bet of $5. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. New users only. First real money wager only. $10 first deposit required. Restrictions apply. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem, call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The Tennessee Red Line at 1-800-889-9789 or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. Let's kick things off with touchdown scoring first, because this is easily one of the more difficult things to figure out going from 2020 to 2021. Last season, we had a huge uptick in scoring across the league. There were over 1,400 offensive touchdowns scored. The highest from 2011 through 2019, so the 9 seasons prior to last year, was 1,286 touchdowns. So the question is this a trend, or is this something that's just naturally going to regress? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think high scoring is here to stay to some degree because offensive holding penalties were down last year. That helped contribute to it. According to data from NFLpenalties.com, we had 477 offensive holding calls last year. The year before that, it was 732. those calls can completely blow up drives, and that limits scoring. Teams are also just getting smarter. They're becoming more aggressive on fourth down, they're using more play action, they're doing things to help their offense. Now, it's hard for me to just say that this type of scoring is here to stay when there was a very obvious thing that happened in 2020 that didn't happen in other seasons, and that's the pandemic. Should we just shrug off the increase in scoring as coincidence, that it coincidentally happened during a season where there was a pandemic? Where there wasn't any real prep for these teams in July and August? And where there weren't any fans in the stadiums for the majority of the season? The lack of prep intuitively can hurt defenses. They need to work more cohesively as a unit because they're not the ones who know what's coming next. And the lack of fans can't be understated either. Opposing quarterbacks don't have to deal with noise at the line of scrimmage, and more control would hypothetically lead to better numbers. So I think we're in store for some regression over last year. Maybe we don't get to 2019 levels, but I'd be surprised if we saw as many touchdowns in 2021 as we did in 2020. Now, I bring this all up because last year, 9 teams scored 50 or more touchdowns. As I mentioned earlier, from 2011 to 2019, that happened 28 times. So we went from it happening about 3 times per season to 9 times last year. This doesn't mean the data that we're working with is irrelevant. It really is just another example to show you guys how absolutely insane 2020 was. And if you're building projections off of that 2020 season, that seems a little naive. One team that stands out in particular is Green Bay, though. They scored 64 times in 2020. That was 5 more than the second place Titans. Now, like I said, we shouldn't necessarily expect the same type of regression that we've seen in history to happen to Green Bay. What I mean by that is, it still seems logical to believe that the NFL will see more scoring than it did pre-pandemic. Because there are reasons for it. So looking at history and saying Green Bay will regress by X amount of touchdowns, that's not necessarily fair. But I will say, only the 2013 Broncos and the 2018 Chiefs scored 64 or more touchdowns since 2011. Those teams saw their touchdowns decrease by 16 and 20 the following year. And if you want to adjust that for the year to be more precise with Green Bay, we could do that. In 2013, that Broncos team scored about 33 more touchdowns than the league average. That's insane. The following year, though, they scored roughly 18 more touchdowns than the league average. So there was a decrease by about 15 touchdowns there. With Kansas City, they went from outperforming the league average by 26 all the way down to 7. So it's a decrease of about 19. Last year, Green Bay outperformed the league average by 20 touchdowns. We've had 14 teams from 2011 through 2019 outscore their league average by 15 or more touchdowns. Of those 14 teams, just one was able to increase on that differential the following season. And the drop in differential was by over 14 touchdowns. In that case, the expectation would be Green Bay outperforming the league average by about 6 this year instead of 20. Which means even if we're adjusting for the changes that we saw offensively last year, it still may not be easy for the Packers to get to 50 touchdowns this year. And this is obviously with all the Aaron Rodgers drama pushed aside. Now, obviously there's an extra game in 2021. And when I do this analysis next year, I'll have to start looking at it on a per game basis. But for now, let's just work within the 16 games because the concept is just easier to grasp. And it's all relative anyway. Me saying Green Bay will decrease in touchdowns means that I'm expecting that to happen on a per game basis. For the Packers, I actually don't think they'll reach 64 touchdowns in 2021, even with that extra game. On this episode, though, it's more about the idea. It's less about the exact projection, if that makes sense. Now, if you're curious, the 9 teams that scored 50 or more touchdowns last year were Baltimore, Kansas City, Minnesota, Seattle, Buffalo, New Orleans, Tampa Bay, Tennessee, and Green Bay. The teams on the higher end that I'd be a little bit more concerned about from a regression standpoint are Tennessee, Tampa Bay, and New Orleans, and then obviously the Packers. The Packers are the one to watch most, though. Now, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you've got the low touchdown scorers. In particular, you have both New York teams. The Jets and Giants both scored just 25 offensive touchdowns last year. That happened just 21 times from 2011 through 2019. And in all but 2 of those cases, the team saw either an increase in touchdowns or the same amount of touchdowns the following year. And the 2 teams who saw a decrease saw just a 1 and a 2 touchdown decrease. If you want to set the parameters a little bit more conservatively, you can look at 30 touchdown teams. We had 72 of those from 2011 to 2019. Only 18% of those teams saw a dip in touchdowns the following year. And none of the teams in that 18% decreased their touchdown total by more than 4. We've had 19 teams over this time frame with touchdown totals from 24 through 26. So right in that 25 range. And among those teams, the average increase from one year to the next in touchdown total was 11.7. Now, one of those teams was actually the 2019 New York Jets, who went from 25 touchdowns to 25 touchdowns. That's really not a common thing to happen. And I'd expect both the Jets and the Giants to see an uptick in touchdowns for a lot of reasons. Natural regression is one, but so is the fact that they'll see regression enhanced because they scored so few touchdowns in a really inviting season for touchdowns. It was a high-scoring year. And there were changes there too this offseason. The Giants added Kenny Golladay most notably. They get Saquon Barkley back. The Jets have a completely new coaching staff and team. There are a lot of reasons to be far more bullish on the New York teams in 2021 versus how they performed in 2020. Now, like I said before, you can also look at how teams are scoring touchdowns. And what was interesting about 2020 was that with the increase in touchdowns scored, we actually saw a decrease in pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. To put that another way, we saw teams running for touchdowns at a higher rate than we've seen before. In 2020, the average pass-to-rush touchdown ratio was 1.77. That's the lowest since 2011, by far. What that means is that we don't have really obvious regression candidates on the high end like we had with Jacksonville in 2019. Let me explain what I mean by that. The Jags 2 years ago had 24 passing touchdowns to 3 rushing touchdowns. There was obvious regression coming, and it happened. They increased their passing touchdown total by 1, but they increased their rushing total by 6. That gave them a much lower pass-to-rush touchdown rate. But I'm more concerned about the teams last season who are on the lower side in pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. Specifically, 3 teams with a ratio under 0.9. Those 3 being the Patriots, Panthers, and the Washington football team. The Panthers are an interesting case because they were a positive regression candidate in this category last year. And nothing changed. Despite a new coaching staff and no Christian McCaffrey for most of the year, the Panthers were very run-oriented with their touchdown scoring. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes regression doesn't fully hit. But I'd still expect that regression to hit at some point. So the Panthers, who had a 0.84 pass-to-rush touchdown ratio last year, should see that number increase in 2021. Why is that the case? Well, we had 13 teams from 2011 to 2019 with a ratio under 1. They scored more touchdowns on the ground than through the air. The only team to become even more run-heavy at scoring touchdowns year over year was last year's Panthers. And they went from a 0.85 ratio to a 0.84 ratio. In fact, they're the only team with a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio under 1.1 to not see an increase the following year. To put this another way, those teams, the Patriots, Panthers, and the football team, they're going to see more touchdowns come through the air than on the ground in 2021 when compared to 2020. I'll get more into this on next week's show with the individual player regression candidates, because there's one in particular who really stands out. Now, lastly, let's touch on the play calling side of things. There were 3 teams last year who had a pass-to-rush ratio under 1, meaning they ran the ball more than they threw the ball. Those teams were Tennessee, New England, and Baltimore. No surprise. I would still expect those teams to try to run the ball a lot in 2021. But for the record, as I stated earlier, among the 30 teams that ran the ball more than they threw the ball from 2011 to 2019, all but 3 increased on that ratio the following year. So 27 of 30 teams became more pass-heavy the following season. And guess what? All 3 of those teams that didn't see an increase in pass-to-rush attempt ratio had Greg Roman coordinating them. It happened twice in San Francisco and once in Baltimore. I do think Baltimore is going to be a little bit more pass-heavy given their off-season moves. But I'm certainly not in the camp that thinks that it's going to be significantly different than the last couple of seasons. To be honest, I'm more interested in the one team that was super pass-heavy last year, and that's the Jacksonville Jaguars. We know that bad teams are generally more pass-heavy than good teams because bad teams play from behind. And when you're playing from behind, you're throwing the ball more to catch up. Last year, no team had a higher pass-to-rush attempt ratio than the 1-win Jags. Their ratio was 1.83, so they threw the ball 1.83 times for every rush. Of the 26 teams with a ratio of 1.7 or greater since 2011, just 3 of them saw that ratio get even higher the following year. This also makes some sense because Jacksonville didn't want to be as pass-heavy as they were last year. And that's the case for a lot of these teams. And I know that because in neutral game scripts, their ratio was 10th highest in football. Their overall ratio was a lot higher than their neutral script ratio, or when games were close. And that neutral script ratio is much more predictive for year N+1 play calling than the overall ratio is. So I would absolutely expect Jacksonville to lean more on the run this season just naturally. They've got enough change on that team that we can't just purely blame any sort of decrease on regression, but I'd expect that to happen nonetheless. Don't just use last year's numbers to project the Jacksonville Jaguars this season. That's a terrible idea on so many levels. Now, I know I threw a lot of data at you in this one, but the data was more so proof than anything else. Proof that if you have a team that did something at the extreme, whether that's the number of touchdowns a team scored, how they scored them, or how they called plays, when you have a team at the extreme, that team tends to regress to the mean the following year. Use that to your advantage. And always remember, whatever happens at the team level will trickle down and affect the player level. I'll get to that next week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.